Whenever there was a failure of a harvest, the rich people, the aristocracy, the local kings and princes and so on, all came in to help people. And there are no recorded instances of people just dying of famines until the British came along. In fact, there are actually accounts by British observers in the late 18th century during the first devastating British-made famine in Bengal, which wiped out a third of the entire population, saying that in the nearby states still ruled by Indians, because Britain hadn't conquered all of India yet, people were being helped. And here in British India, they were not being helped as a matter of policy. Now, in Ireland, they did the same thing, which led to the Great Potato Blight of 1841 and the deaths of people. But the Irish at least had the option of jumping onto boats and sailing off to America. We didn't have that option. So we stayed in India and died. And the worst example that one can come to is Winston Churchill and the Second World War. Winston Churchill personally took decisions to allow people to die while his government acquired all the grain in Bengal that they could get, not to feed the war effort, as was wrongly suggested, but to enhance buffer stocks, reserve stocks, in the event of a likely future invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia. And Australian ships were docking at the port of Calcutta laden with wheat. And Churchill was personally deciding, either he or his odious Paymaster General, Lord Cherwell, acting on his instructions, to not allow those ships to disembark their cargo, but to continue to sail on to Europe. When officials in India wrote to him saying, people are dying, they're literally dying on the streets, he said, well, I hate Indians, they're a beastly people with a beastly religion. It's all their fault anyway for breeding like rabbits. These are all exact quotes, verbatim. And when one particular memo reached the Prime Minister's desk about the unconscionable number of deaths, it ended up being 4.3 million. All Churchill could bring himself to do was to write in the margin, somewhat peevishly, why hasn't Gandhi died yet? Now, this is the man whom the British expect us to hail as an apostle of freedom and democracy. He has as much blood on his hands as the worst genocidal dictators of the 20th century.
So then, remedy. We're here at the Antidote Festival. What is the antidote to a historical wrong, as you've laid out here? The Oxford Union debate was on the subject of reparations. Is it fiscal? Is it political? Is it an apology? Where do we go from here?
Well, you know, I got saddled with this reparations thing because that was the topic the Oxford Union students chose, Ben. And the fact is that even in that debate, I said that you can't really quantify the value of the damage done by the British. How do you put a price on these 35 million Indians who died totally unnecessary deaths in those famines? How do you measure the lives and livelihoods of the weavers whose thumbs were chopped off so they couldn't weave again when their looms were smashed? In case the looms were rebuilt, they no longer could ply their craft. How could you measure all of this? I mean, the financial drainage has been calculated. In fact, an Englishman called William Digby in 1901 published a 900-page book, which I have on my laptop, in which he worked out down to the last penny and shilling how much the British had each year repatriated to England from India. But, I mean, it was after that India spent the equivalent of 80 billion pounds sterling in supporting the First World War, and so on. So those numbers have long since been overtaken. So I don't want to go the financial route. In that debate, I said even a symbolic £1 a year for the next 200 years will do it, because the larger point is not finance, but reparations, but atonement, I beg your pardon. Is not reparations, but atonement. Why do I say that? Because reparations, any sum of money that would be payable would not be credible, and any sum that would be credible, that would take into account all this damage, would not be payable. So why go down that route? Atonement, however, is necessary. I think all sinners need to atone. And Mahatma Gandhi, in fact, is the one who wrote to a viceroy that he considers British rule in India to be a sin. And for him, that was a very strong word, because a sin was. But at the same time, he had the very Hindu notion that you must hate the sin and not the sinner. So once the sin was over, once the Union Jack had come down, there was no more any rancor towards the sinner, because he was no longer a sinner. However, what about the past sins? And my answer is, first of all, well, there are three things I'd like to suggest to the British, and indeed have been suggesting to the British. The first is, I think they should teach unvarnished colonial history in their schools. There's this very convenient historical amnesia in Britain today. as a result of which what's happening is that you can do an A level in history in Britain today without learning a line of colonial history. Most people don't know what the British did, to the extent that YouGov, which is a poll that often looks at young people's views in Britain, every year for the last few years, I've quoted one, but there's been another poll which is even worse, showing that a significant proportion of young English people actually are proud of the empire and would love to have it back. They have no idea what they're proud of, so they've got to be taught. That's one thing. Linked to that, I would say, is there needs to be more by way of memorials and museums. London is just absolutely covered with museums of various sorts, many of which are full of the products of theft from colonies. They're sort of chor bazaar for the Indians in the audience, masquerading as museums. But having said that, you can even find an imperial war museum in Britain, but you can't find an imperial museum, a colonialism museum. There's no place for children, tourists, visitors to go to and see for themselves the whole picture of what was done by the British and their foreign rule. And the third thing, oh, by the way, there's even a statue to the animals that aided the war effort in Britain, right in the heart of London. I've driven past it. And there is no statue to the 1.3 million Indians who gave of their own and won an improbable number of Victoria Crosses and so on in the First World War, and the 1.7 million Indians who fought in the Second World War. No statue to them. The animals, however, are commemorated. The British really have to recognize the debt that they owe. Finally, you mentioned an apology. To me, that is important. And I've got the perfect opportunity for it looming right now. On the 13th of April 2019, will be the centenary of what I consider the single worst atrocity of the British Empire, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the Amritsar massacre, some people call it. Not because of the numbers of people killed. The British actually killed 100,000 people in Delhi alone in putting down the revolt of 1857. But rather because of everything that accompanied it. We'll give you 2 minutes to explain. It came at the end of the First World War, which even Mahatma Gandhi had supported the Indian war effort. And Indians had sent money, treasure, taxes which they could not afford, pack animals, rations, clothing, uniforms, carts, even rail lines ripped out of the ground to aid the war effort, in the hope that at the end of all of this, there would be the grant of what the British had promised to the white Commonwealth, responsible self-government. It never came. They betrayed the promise. And not only did they betray it, but they actually reimposed wartime era prohibitions on freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and so on. Immediately protests broke out, saying this is simply not what we were promised. And the British, in effect, declared martial law. They didn't use the phrase, but they sent generals out to the various provinces to put down the unrest. In Amritsar, the second largest town in Punjab, we had the arrival of Brigadier General Reginald Dyer. And he got there and he proclaimed that people couldn't gather in groups of more than 5 and so on and so forth. But he completely failed to notice that this was the Punjabi Spring Festival of Baisakhi. And in a walled garden called Jallianwala Bagh, a large number of men, women and children had gathered to commemorate the festival, completely unarmed. He arrives there with a bunch of soldiers. He doesn't ask them what they're doing there and why they're there. He doesn't even take a look at who they are. He doesn't fire a warning shot. He just orders his soldiers to shoot into the bodies of the unarmed, wailing, soon stampeding men, women, and children. And as they try to flee this garden, this walled garden, there's only one gate, one exit. And he stations the soldiers right there, as he himself explains later, because that makes these people easier targets. 1,650 rounds were fired, and he boasted proudly not one bullet was wasted. The British admitted to 379 killed and the rest injured. The Indians claimed the figures are much higher. Whatever the truth was, it was a horrendous, horrendous massacre. At the end of it, he bars the gate shut and doesn't allow even the relatives of the dead, the dying, and the wounded to tend to their dear ones. They are forced to lie for 24 hours in the hot April sun, many of whom die because of that. On top of that, he forces Indians to crawl on their bellies on a narrow lane nearby, and if they so much as lift their heads are bashed in by British staves. At the end of all of this, of course, there is outrage. The House of Commons condemns him. The House of Lords promptly passes a resolution praising him for what he had done. And the British take out a collection to reward him. and they raised the equivalent of £250,000 in today's money, which is presented to him with a bejeweled sword, and that flatulent voice of Victorian imperialism, Rudyard Kipling, hails him as the man who saved India. Now that entire package, the betrayal at the beginning, the cruelty of the massacre, the racism and indifference to Indian suffering that followed, the justification and reward, you take the whole thing together, and to me it makes it the single most fitting act that is worthy of an apology. And if somebody on the centenary of that event, somebody from the royal family, because